Good afternoon. Good to see all of you, and we welcome our four senators to the panel. Let me apologize first of all for the scratchy voice, but that's what it is. And you didn't come to hear me anyhow; you came to hear the four senators. So, I want to start by just recognizing that this is the Frank Fahrenkopf and Chuck Manatt luncheon. And I think for purposes of this discussion, I don't know two people who better embodied the very best of American politics than Frank Fahrenkopf and Chuck Manatt. And they're both good friends of mine, mentors of mine. Frank is here today. Kathy and Dan and Michelle are here today representing the Manatt family. So I think we owe a great debt of gratitude to Frank and all the Manatt family. So good afternoon and welcome to Crossfire.
Yeah, could be.
No, not today. Actually, if you came for Crossfire, you came to the wrong place today. We're more interested, I think, in ceasefire today. A ceasefire to a lot of the vitriol and maybe the excessive partisanship and sometimes the downright meanness that we see too much of from Capitol Hill. And, you know, it didn't always used to be that way. Here also today is former Congressman Sam Farr, good friend up front here. Sam and I met when we were both legislative aides in the California legislature. Trent, I was working for a Republican.
Oh, my goodness. Jeez.
Sam was working for a Democrat. But I remember those days, and Sam does too, where and there were some strong leaders around that time. Ronald Reagan was governor. George Moscone was the Senate leader. Jess Unruh was the Assembly leader. Bob Monahan was a Republican leader in the House. Howard Way, the Republican leader in the Senate. And they fought like hell during the day, but you know what? At night, they got together, they had dinner, they had a few drinks, often at the governor's mansion. Ronald Reagan inviting them over.
Yeah, that's good.
And during the campaigns, they fought like hell to win every election they were involved in. But when the elections were over, they got down to something called governing, if we remember what that was all about, too. And for a while, it was that way in Washington, at least for a while. I remember the days of some great Senate leaders, Republican leaders like Bob Dole and Trent Lott, Democratic leaders like George Mitchell and Tom Daschle, when we got things done, reached across the aisle, and the purpose was solving problems. So when Dr. Brown talked to me first about this panel today, I said, well, first, got to see if we can get Tom Daschle and Trent Lott, and how lucky we are to have the two of them here. And then we said, well, let's get a couple of members who served with them and couldn't do any better than the great Olympia Snowe from the state of Maine and Mary Landrieu from the state of Louisiana. So welcome to you all, and thanks so much for giving us your time today. As all the programs today, we're trying to look forward, not so much backwards, but I do want to start with a general question to get each of you to comment. So when did things start to go south, and what happened? Trent, you start.
I don't know if I like that term, started to go south, meaning down. But
Sorry.
That's right, that's true. You know, I've thought a lot about that. I came to Washington in 1968 to be a staff member to a Democrat. Bill Calmer was chairman of the Rules Committee. Those were pretty tough times in 1968, as you recall. Watergate, Vietnam, civil rights issues, Martin Luther King had just been assassinated. There were machine guns on the steps of the Capitol. So that was not an easy time. But then during the 70s and in the House and in the 80s when I was whip with Reagan as president, you know, I got to know, and always in the minority in the House as a Republican during those 16 years. But I got to know some great guys on both sides of the aisle. I had a very sweet relationship, frankly, with Tip O'Neill. And of course, I love people like Danny Rostenkowski and Tom Foley. And we got Tony Coelho is here too. Did Tony leave? He was here earlier. And Bob Michael, and Bob was always in the minority, but he was a loyal soldier. And then moved over to the Senate in '88. I think, Tom, you had been there 2 years when I got there. the camaraderie, the relationship between George Mitchell and Bob Dole was so good I actually didn't like it because they didn't seem to mind staying late at night and I wanted to go home and be with Tricia. So I started complaining loudly about that. And then, of course, got into leadership as whip and leader, and then I was out. You know, I made a mistake along the way. I was out of leadership for a while, then I came back. When I came back in 2006, I was floored at how much more difficult it had gotten to get things done and how much meaner it had gotten. So within about a year and a half after I got back as whip, I decided I was beginning to become cynical myself. I didn't have Tom Daschle to rely on, and I figured it was time for me to move on. So I really think that it started, you know, remember we had a lot of unity and did a lot of good things together after 9/11, 2001, 2002. The approval rating of the Congress went way up. So I really think it started to slide in the 04, 06 period. And I remember asking the Republican conference one day in 2006, what are the three things we stand for now, if we had to tell the people? And you know, silence. And maybe part of it was the Senate started swinging back and forth, and every senator got up saying, if I can win today or I can beat the other guy, I'll be in the majority. So I put where it really started deteriorating in the 2004, 5, 6, 7 period. And I don't think it's gotten any better, maybe even worse as time has gone by.
Mary?
Well, I think Trent has summarized it well, and I think maybe pinpointed the time frame. It's hard to put your finger on one, particular something that happened, but I'd have to believe that the influx of third-party money into the process, which sort of now outnumbers the funding that we raise ourselves, which amplifies our own voice in a campaign. In my last campaign, I could hardly recognize it because it wasn't my voice or kind of, my views. It was coming from so many different directions, and that tends to pull people apart and not find common ground. I think all of us that are running, no matter if you're a Democrat or Republican, I was a purple state that's gone a little bit more red, but when I would run, I wouldn't go out just red meat speeches every day. I would be talking to all sorts of different crowds, trying to pull people into a discussion about how we could maybe do healthcare better, what was a proper level of spending for defense, how would you approach something, and that kind of work that we take pride in as leaders. If you're a good leader worth your salt, you're trying to lead everyone in your state or in your area, not just a group. But these third-party groups aren't interested in everybody. They're interested in their specific segment. So I think that's been part of it. And then the only other thing I would add, and I know governments aren't perfect. I know our government isn't. We make mistakes all the time, overreaching, over-regulation in one area, and then sometimes totally ignoring problems in another. But every day I go to bed and I think, thank God I'm in the United States of America that has generally a functioning government. Now we'll see after this current administration is through, but we generally have a functioning government, and you can yell and scream all about it, but what would you have if you didn't have any government? Which is sort of what I think our discussion is, how to make it work better.
Mm-hmm. Senator Snowe?
Yes, well, I think Trent sort of pinpointed the moment things were changing. I always evaluated from the standpoint, can you get things done? To the point that you raised, Bill, about governing, which is obviously the purpose of public service, is whether or not you can solve problems. And over the years of my service, both in the House and describing the days, for example, in the 1980s with Tip O'Neill and President Reagan, where you were able to come together. I was part of the Gypsy Mosque Boll Weevil group. The Gypsy Mosque with the Northeast Republicans and the Boll Weevils with the Southern Democrats. I'll leave it up to you to determine why we're named after, invasive insects. But in any event, probably an apt description. But in any event, we made it work. And I know when I came to the Senate, my first year in the Senate in in 95, we had a government shutdown. And, as part of the centrist coalition at that time was spearheaded by John Breaux and Senator Chafee. And years later, we were able to work together on a bipartisan budget. We wanted to demonstrate, even in the midst of that shutdown, that we had the ability to negotiate a budget. And we produced a balanced budget and ultimately offered it on the floor when government reopened. And although it didn't pass, it failed by a slight margin, it was used as a predictor for the balanced budgets that subsequently were accomplished in 1997 and for 4 consecutive years. But to the point of how we could solve problems, I think is exemplified by, Trent and Tom as leaders. I know in 2001 we had a 50-50 Senate, and it was in the aftermath of the Bush-Gore decision, the Supreme Court on the election. And many of us were concerned about whether or not we would lose the ability to solve problems on a bipartisan basis. And so we asked both Trent and Tom to come to a meeting, the Centrist Coalition, which I was now co-chairing with John Breaux at the time, and almost a quarter of the Senate showed up. And they ended up shaking hands. In fact, I have a picture that I'm going to show all of you at the end because I think it's so important to demonstrate how it used to work. But finally, I think it became, at least in the Senate, is the inability to be able to work across the aisle. Mary and I co-chaired the Common Ground Coalition. And unfortunately, eventually, we could not work on a bipartisan basis because we could not build a strong coalition in the Senate anymore to solve the problems that we needed to address. And so I think then it became apparent to me, I made my decision not to seek re-election in 2012, was the fact that we could no longer solve problems on a bipartisan basis.
So Senator Daschle and Senator Lott have actually written a book about their working together called Crisis Point. It's still available on Amazon.
Good.
And Tom, this is 2016, and you said, it's no exaggeration to say that the state of our democracy is as bad as we've ever seen it. When did it start going bad?
Well, Bill, I first of all want to just identify with the things that have already been said by my 3 colleagues. I strongly agree. Comity is so important in legislating. And we've come to a point in the Senate and politics and governments all over, I think, where compromise is viewed as capitulation. And that's so unfortunate because compromise is the essence of governance in a democratic republic. It's the essence of governance. You have to find ways to bring people together, and these 3 were superstars at doing that, and I mean that sincerely. I'm going to quickly say I think there are 4 factors. I can't put my finger on when these factors surface, but all 4 factors, and Trent's heard me say these a lot, but I'd start with the airplane. The fact is that the airplane has caused people to leave on Thursday, they come back on Tuesday, we try to run the country on Wednesday. And you can't run a country this complicated 1 or 2 days a week. The airplane was huge. The second is technology. Social media has really created a whole different environment. The tweets and the social comments made on Facebook and all the things that go on, the scrutiny and all of the glare of the lights around cable news, all of that has changed the dynamic a lot. The third thing is money. My race in 2004 at that moment was the most expensive race. A total of $54 million was spent in a small state like South Dakota. We have 700,000 people and $54 million. But that's nothing compared to the $130 million that was spent last time in 2 states. And so money is driving it. A typical senator has to raise about $20,000 a day to be ready for a competitive race if there is one. So money is really a huge problem. And the final thing is the primary has now become more important than the general election in so many states, either in a district or in a state. And when the primary becomes more important, you're far more interested in placating your base. And who is in your base? The far right and the far left. And so you don't want to compromise because then you will be accused of capitulating. So those 4 factors, it seems to me, have played a big role.
Hey, Bill, before you go forward, let me take just a point of personal privilege. My school teacher mother would be mad at me if I didn't take just a minute to say how much I really am proud to be on the panel with this group. I've got such memories of working with each one of them. Mary and I, after Katrina, every time I would go to get some money, Louisiana would get more of what I got than Mississippi did.
Don't listen to him, that is not true.
But we worked together for many years. Olympia Snowe, believe it or not, was my chief deputy whip when I was the whip in the House. The highest ranking woman, in a leadership position at that time in history. It's hard to believe, chief deputy whip. She did a great job. Some people said, why would you put Olympia in your whip organization? I said, because I want her in on the takeoff, so maybe she'll be there on the landing. And then Tom and I, we give speeches all around the country in different groups, a lot of student groups. But the amazing thing is that people come up and say, y'all seem to be friends. Like, you can't be friends if you're Democrat and Republicans. And, Tom and I did a lot of work together. People say, oh, it was a different time. It was easy. Just remember, we went through 9/11. We went through the 50-50 Senate. We did through the impeachment trial of William Jefferson Clinton. We had some tough things to deal with, but it's like everybody else. When you go through trial by fire, you become great friends. And so I have really valued my relationship with Tom. And Tom's leadership with the Democrats made it possible for me to be a better leader for the Republicans. So I had to just say that because I love this group. I'm honored to be here. And I want to say, Frank, thank you, and to the Manatt family for doing a lecture series like this. It's what we would expect from you, Frank, even though you never hired me after I retired. I didn't want to say that. But forgive me for doing that, but I had to get that on the record.
Well, I just want to...
Senator?
No, I
Yes.
just want to add a point about Trent's approach as a leader. He used to come up to me, he said, I know, Olympia, you're not going to be with us. He said, but could you be a little less passionate?
So one of the things that I was pleased and surprised maybe to read in the book was that you guys, there's another factor, which is talking to each other, right? And I don't know how much of that takes place today, but you actually had a hot phone. Tell us about that, Tom.
Well, when we became leaders, I think it was Trent's suggestion, but he said, if you know the way the Senate is arranged, the Republican leader's office is down the hall. In fact, it occupies a very special place in history. It was the original chamber of the House of Representatives. And we were in kind of the so-called new area of the Senate. The last edition, created in 1850. So you've got to walk about maybe 50 yards. And Trent said that he didn't think that really allowed for adequate communication sometimes when you really had to call somebody quickly. So we had installed on our desks a direct line to his desk and to mine. Nobody else answered it. When that rang, I knew it was him. And we used it a lot, and it really made a difference. Sometimes he didn't use the phone. He just came over and busted in on me. It didn't matter.
I knew where the
if I was
back
in the
door
middle of
was.
an important meeting, he would just show up. He'd even show up at my press conferences occasionally.
Well, one of the purposes, too, quite frankly, was if we walked down that hall, the press would know that we were fixing to get together. And sometimes our colleagues didn't even like it when we were getting together. And also, sometime I wanted to talk to Tom without my staff or his staff knowing we were talking, because sometimes they had an agenda of their own, or they were nervous that we might agree to do something that wouldn't be particularly liked in our conferences. So it served us well. And in 9/11, I picked up the phone after I realized we were under attack and said, hey, Tom, and he was the majority leader then. I said, I think we better evacuate the Capitol. And about that time, security busted in and said, we're taking you out of here. So it was a good use that we made of it.
Mary, I want to ask you about Tom's comment about the airplane. It is true. I mean, in coming from California, I know how much time people from California spend on that plane. Sam can speak to that better than anyone. But that does cut down on the opportunity to, right, get families together or just get the members together.
Absolutely, and when I was elected to the Senate, I was mentored by Bennett Johnson and John Breaux and a little bit by Russell Long, who was still alive then, and Bennett and John, and because John grew up, well, he grew up, they raised their kids next to Trent. So John would tell me all these stories about how they got to be so close and the kids were raised together, and Mary, it would be so good for you to have your family in D.C. So I took that advice, and it was the best advice anyone ever gave me. I got beat up about it at home all the time, but as a mom and as a senator, trying to be close to my kids, doing a good job in the Senate, doing a good job as mom, that's what I wanted to do. But also, I thought it would help me to get to know the Senate better, to get to know my colleagues better, and as a result, I would see Olympia almost every morning on her way to the cleaners next door, to my house, and Ron Wyden, because I live next to the cleaners. This is really funny, but it's kind of a way you get to meet your neighbors, because I was here. Now, I traveled home a lot. I thought I did my job well. I was attentive to my district, but I do think Tom has a point when he talks about once the House particularly got in this fly-in Tuesday morning, fly-out Thursday. How do you have any time to even visit with your staff and your meetings of your constituents, let alone spend any time with colleagues, even in your own party? Yeah. So, I mean, I don't even know how people find the time. So I think that's a real problem, what we do about it. I think it would help if people could spend more time together in more social, like it was when Trent first came here with John Breaux.
Yeah.
Senator Snowe, Tom also mentioned the money. I mean, the fact is, members and senators have to spend, it's almost full-time campaigning now, isn't it?
It truly is. In fact, it's changed dramatically even over the years in which I served in the House and Senate, where money became increasingly important factor. Even in the conversations, excuse me, in the conversations on a daily basis. And how much money that you were raising, the goals that Tom was speaking of, which was true. And if you look at the fact that now virtually every member of the House and Senate is required to have a leadership pact. I think I was one of the few in the Senate that did not, even though they weren't in leadership, weren't running for leadership, but that added another dimension of responsibilities in terms of fundraising in addition to your own pact. So it became all-consuming. And so if you're talking about, a compact week of 3 days compressing between fundraising and legislation and the schedule, it virtually left little time to get to know your colleagues, let alone meet the legislative demands that were so essential and so important to this country. That's why those of us who are with the Bipartisan Policy Center, which Tom co-founded, and Trent and Tom were co-chairs of a group that I was a part of as well on the Commission on Political Reform. We recommend 5-day work weeks. Have 3 weeks where you're working in Washington and 1 week where you can be in your state or your district, so that you can compartmentalize your time, focus on legislation. But the fundraising part has become a huge dimension. We should disclose all the dark money, frankly, that Mary was speaking of. We should have disclosure, have more accountability in terms of who is contributing, to these organizations that are playing an outsized role in influencing the outcome of these races. But the demands for fundraising has become astronomical. In fact, if you think about the outside money that is expended in these campaigns, last election was $1.4 billion. $1.4 billion in outside money. And, compare that to 1990, just to give you a dimension, it was $7 million. So we're talking 195 times more money that's just spent with outside groups that having a disproportionate influence on the process, and obviously compels candidates to raise more money, because it's not only the person you're running against, but you're also having to insulate yourself against these organizations who are airing these ads as well.
Tom, let me ask you, and I'd like the others to comment as well. Be kind to talk show hosts here, but with the lack of civility, the lack of comedy, what role does the media play?
Well, I think the media plays a lot. What has happened, and I think we all acknowledge the tribalism that's evolved over the last 20 years. I mean, we've, Trent and I've talked about it. He watches Fox, and occasionally, I don't watch a lot of television, but I go to the more progressive and liberal sites on the web a lot. And so, you know, I check out the Wall Street Journal, but I really devote myself to those news sources that I agree with. But I do think cable news and the social media in particular, cable news I don't think is quite as prominent a factor as it was maybe 15 years ago, but they're still there. I mean, you look at today maybe a Sean Hannity or somebody like that who still has a big viewing audience. But I think the social media and cable news have had a profound effect on the environment politically today.
And Trent, you, as I recall, you were a leader with President Bush on immigration reform until talk radio stepped in.
Absolutely. That was one of the most disappointing experiences I had. I got involved in immigration reform in 2007. I was back as whip, and the president asked me to be involved in the process and trying to get something through the committee, through the Judiciary Committee, that we could take to the floor and hopefully deal with the need for immigration reform, legal and illegal. So I worked with Ted Kennedy and Dianne Feinstein and John McCain and Lindsey Graham and John Kyle, a good group of people on the Judiciary Committee, and we came up with a pretty good bill. Got it to the floor, and I did a radio interview, which basically I said I didn't like the wall, that I had goats on my little small farm in Mississippi, and I'd learned you can't pin them in. A fence won't do it. They'll go over, under, and around, and I thought people were at least as smart as goats. Rush Limbaugh did not like my commentary, and he blocked my phone for 2 full weeks with calls. But just to throw him off, I'd go to the office early there for a while, and I'd answer the phone. And I had 3 death threats over my effort to try to get immigration reform. But when I'd answer the phone, I'd just say hello, and they said, "Who is this?" I said, "Well, who are you calling?" "We're calling Trent Lott." I said, "This is Trent Lott. Can I help you?" So I had them under my control immediately because I had answered the phone. But we were making progress. I wouldn't have voted for the bill in the condition it was in when we had it on the floor and we had a procedural vote. But I still thought we were making progress, and in the end, I hoped that I could be able to vote for it. So we're down in the well, and I'm working with John Kyle and Lindsey Graham to try to get Republicans to vote for it, and Ted Kennedy, Dianne Feinstein, Harry Reid were trying to get Democrats to vote for it. Democrats were coming in and voting against it because of the guest worker provisions that Labor didn't like. And Republicans were coming in and voting against it because Rush Limbaugh said it was amnesty. And down it went on a procedural vote. Just think how different things would probably be now if we had been able to get immigration, broad-based immigration reform done then. And by the way, you know, you might say, well, why? You're from Mississippi. You don't have big immigration problems. No, that's the thing I don't understand. It's not just about the problem in your state or the problem with a particular issue. It is about your country. And when you get to where you can't find a way to get the result that's good for the country, you have a problem. And I remember standing in the well, and it was the only time in my 19 years in the Senate that I was ashamed to be a senator. I was embarrassed by the cowardice that I witnessed. And that was one of the 2 or 3 issues that caused me to decide that it was time for me to move on. After 35 years in Congress, some people came up and said, well, you're back in leadership. You can't be leaving. I said, why not? I've been doing this for 35 years. Plus, my wife had said, don't you think it's time you get a job, a real job? But let me tell you one other story. We have a really fine congressman from Mississippi now named Greg Harper. He's been in the House 10 years. He just led the legislative effort to deal with the sexual abuse issues in the House. He's a good man, good congressman. He's not going to run again after 10 years. And I asked him, I said, why are you leaving? You're chairman of a committee, a minor committee. You're going to be chairman of the major committee. He said, I'm just tired of flying back and forth every week and sleeping on a blow-up mattress in my office. Yeah. And I said, Greg, I told you should bring your family. And it's a total embarrassment to you and to me that you're sleeping in your damn office. But that's what happens. You see all these retirements? I don't know how many now. It's up to 40, high 40s.
Over 60.
More Republicans
Democratic
than ever.
and Republican.
But a huge herd. You know what? It's not fun. They're miserable. For over 40 sleep in their offices. That's Tom describes it, I believe, as the worst form of public housing in America. I love to take his lines, but at least we give each other credit. But, it is a different time, and talking, I don't want to hog this too much, but one of the things, in addition to the airplane, in addition to the lack of communication, there's also a lack of camaraderie and chemistry. Tom and I didn't want to hurt him. He was a friend. Because I could talk to him, I could be honest with him. And sometimes we took on our conferences. And I remember one particular instance where we both were going against our conferences, but we knew it needed to be done. And we went to the floor and said, we're going to do it right now. And you know what happened? They said, oh, okay. And we did it that day. So you do need this chemistry. You also need strong leadership occasionally. I found that when a leader is kind of hesitant and cowardly, the team won't follow.
No.
We need some men and we need some women that had the courage of people like Olympia. Olympia gave me heartburn all the time, making deals with John Bro, for God's sake. And so I had to watch it. But you gotta have that, and we've lost it. And just one final point. That's why we had the singing senators, Seersucker Thursday, Tartan Day, spouse dinner, so that we would laugh at each other and be with each other.
Seersucker?
Seersucker Thursday, yeah. Uh-huh.
Right. So we will have time for questions from all of you as well. But you, Senator, you've kind of moved us in the direction of maybe looking forward to some solutions. You talked about chemistry. Obviously, I think we'd agree we need better chemistry. But you cannot. The chemistry is either there or it's not. Right? Does this get back to the kind of people that we're electing, and does that get back to your point about how the districts are drawn?
I think that's a part of it, but I also think that there are things you can do, and Trent and I talk about it in the book. I lament that there aren't more joint caucuses. I really think that joint caucuses, right now, caucuses meet 2 or 3 times a week, and they meet separately, and they become sort of rallies more than they are discussions. You rally your troops, and they go out on the floor. It's like a team, and you're going to go kill the other guys. But joint caucuses create the opportunity for better chemistry. So that's number one. The other thing that I think, and I'm all for C-SPAN and transparency, but there are times when it helps not to have the cameras. And the best example of that, Trent and I had to manage this historic impeachment experience. And one of the decisions, do we have it televised or not have it televised? And we decided to compromise and say, well, we're going to televise until 6, and after 6 it's going to be in what we called executive session. You wouldn't believe how stark the difference was in the environment and the discussion between the time when everybody was on camera speaking to the camera and everybody was off camera speaking to themselves, speaking to each other. We need to have more of those opportunities where people can speak candidly without worrying about whether they're going to upset their base or being misinterpreted or somehow just not saying the thing that should be the most politically correct. So all those things, I think, could make a big difference in recreating some of the chemistry that is so critical.
But one of the issues that obviously I think is overshadowing the governing process is the fact that now it's really focusing on the narrow base of the political parties. I mean, Tom spoke to the fact about primaries. As you know, there is now the concern, obviously, for elected officials is about being primaried, which ordinarily had not been the case. I mean, obviously, you're concerned about being a primary, but also looking to the general election. But the primaries have become so heavily focused today that there's no incentive for members of Congress to cross the political aisle. And to illustrate the point, there was this statistic that showed that 1987 there were 57 senators who represented one party, but their states voted for the presidential candidate of the other party. Today there are about 15 senators in the United States Senate that are in that category. So that means that 85% of the Senate doesn't really have an incentive to work across the political aisle because everything dovetails to the narrow ideological basis of the political parties. So there's no impetus to work across the aisle, to build the bipartisan solutions because, obviously that gets you a strong primary. That's why we advocate open primaries having independent redistricting commissions, because that is critically important. There are very few competitive, House seats now. It could be anywhere from, 10, 20, maybe 30 seats altogether that may be truly competitive. And there's some key cases that are pending before the Supreme Court that could have an impact ultimately, not so much perhaps on this election, but the one in 2020.
Mary, I want to ask you about a four-letter word, okay? Earmarks.
I'm a big fan. Let me just say something before I get into earmarks.
Is it a dirty word, earmarks?
No, it is not. But I want to respond to something Olympia said. I think between the conversation we've had, we've presented a couple of really good ideas about how to move forward. Like, looking back, when did it start? But it's more important to look forward. And I think the 5-day work week, looking at the dark money, Tom's idea about bipartisan caucus opportunities, spending more time together to get to know each other will help. But this districting idea is so important, what Olympia brought up, because when the districts are rigged, and that's what they are, rigged for one party or another, and not set up to reflect the dreams and aspirations of either the region, the city, the state, or the nation, I think we do a disservice to our country. And I think that is very important. Is a lot of political pushback on that, but hopefully we can get there. On earmarks, I served on the Appropriations Committee, thanks to Tom Daschle, who gave me an opportunity to serve as a young senator, and loved every minute of it, and was mentored by some amazing appropriators. And I do believe that at some point that process of earmarking was done in a way that wasn't as ethical or as transparent as it should have been. But I do believe that you can make those changes, make them ethical, make them transparent, and it helps put skin in the game of the members on the Appropriations Committee and their constituents that are asking for this special attention to a rice mill in Mississippi or Louisiana, or something, a seafood processing plant that's in Maine that's important to that community, or a naval station, et cetera. And it helps the process to move forward. Without something that the members feel like they can have some skin in the game, it's hard to get those budgets through. And then on a different note, I don't know why Congress would give up the power of the purse, which is expressly granted in the Constitution, for us to allocate and direct less than 1% of the funding of the United States government, less than 1%. In that way. So I think that some of the members, Republicans and Democrats, are exploring the possibility to try to get that appropriations and budget process moving, like Olympia said. There were times on our committee, I remember when Ted Stevens and Danny Inouye ran our committee. They ran it with absolutely virtually no partisanship whatsoever. Yeah. Those bills would come out, not unanimous, but they would come out in regular order, with all the appropriators going to the floor and letting the leaders know, we're with you, we got your back, we're voting for our bills. And yeah, there were always people yelling, grandstanding on this or that, but the bulk of us, just bought into it and moved it. Those days are gone.
And earmarks are a way of bringing people together, I guess, right? Because you've got to...
Well, it's a way of getting people committed to what's in the bill. I mean, if it's hard to vote against something if you've got 2 or 3 really important projects, and they could be $1 million here or $10 million there. I mean, one of the proudest earmarks I did, and I'm very happy, and it was one of the last ones I did, I helped build the World War II Museum in New Orleans.
Boy,
and I am
too.
very proud of taking, Danny Inouye looked at me and said, how bad do you want this? I said, Danny, it's so important for our country. I said, you take all my earmarks away from this, this, and this, and put it towards that Freedom Pavilion at the World War II Museum. And every time I walk in there, I almost start to cry.
And it wouldn't have happened.
And it would
if you
not
hadn't had that
have
earmark.
happened. It would not, well, maybe the museum would have eventually been built, maybe over a longer period of time, but that, and Senator Vitter did it too. I mean, it wasn't just me, but we both put our earmarks to that. And I'll always think of that as a very positive, at Danny's request, as it, with my urging, Danny and Senator Inouye and Senator Stevens even did more. But anyway, that's just an example.
Bill, I agree. I think we should put earmarks back in place. There needs to be transparency. There needs to be a process. But clearly, it could help. I think that Congress has abdicated their constitutional responsibility. In the firm I'm in now, we've got a guy named Rodney Slater, who was Secretary of Transportation, a great guy, with Bill Clinton. And he said, you know, we earmarked. Y'all would send the money over to the Transportation Department. I'd meet with my executive group, and we'd say, okay, we're going to put this money in this bridge in Minnesota and this money in the port in Louisiana. So the administrations are doing it, but Congress has abdicated that responsibility. But I do believe in transparency. One time I got $50 million for the bridge in my hometown of Pascagoula, and I was going to a leadership meeting, and the New York Times guy said, oh, Senator Lott, is it true you got $50 million as an earmark for a bridge in your hometown of Pascagoula, Mississippi? I stopped and I said, well, hell yes, where'd you think I'd put it, Brooklyn? He was so shocked, he never even wrote it up. But I want to give you one glimmer of hope. In the recent budget agreement, where there was communication between Schumer and McConnell, they got at least a number for the budget. Maybe we'll get the 18 budget before we get to 19. But they also included in there a little item that most people have not noticed, and it was a bicameral, bipartisan budget process committee, where you're going to have Republicans and Democrats, House and Senate, including some new or good people like Roy Blunt from Missouri, who served in the House and now is in the Senate, was a whip in the House, and new people like Senator Perdue from Georgia, who, if you don't know him yet, you're going to be impressed. But it's bipartisan, bicameral. It's time that they take a look at the rules. Do we really need to filibuster the motion to even proceed to a bill, to even debate a bill, and require 60 votes? They've just become muscle bound. And they do need to take a look at the budget process and reforms of the institution. It's not an insult to change with the times. Or as Winston Churchill will say, when the facts change, I change my position. Makes good sense to me. But I had to put that little point in there. There's some good work creeping in that could make a difference.
Universal assent here on earmarks?
Absolutely. There just isn't enough investment today in the legislation on the floor. And it's that personal investment that people feel if they've got some opportunity to say that they're something that they can identify with is going to occur. And I think ideology and all of this polarized environment to a large extent has dictated how people look at legislation today. This makes it more practical, more real, more tangible, more palpable. And I think it could make a big difference. So I agree with both Trent and Mary.
Yeah, as long as the process is transparent, but we shouldn't give all the agencies the ability to make those decisions. And furthermore, on the budget process, I mean, it is broken down.
Yeah.
And I think, frankly, we should have a biennial budget. I think that would go a long way towards improving the process. But more than anything else, you have members of Congress and the leadership adhering to a process and requiring it to happen. I mean, frankly, the budget resolution statutorily is required to be passed by April 15th. Now, you know what happens to all of us if we don't meet our April 15th deadline with the IRS. The same should be true for the United States Congress. Frankly, I happen to think no budget, no pay. That's interesting. Am I alone in that?
No, I agree.
So when did compromise become a dirty word? It sort of is today.
Well, you're not so much interested in a demarcation, but I think all of these different things contributed to it. Compromise does require leadership. You got to have women and men that are willing to talk and find the sweet spot. Tom and I never started in the same place. I mean, Tom was probably a little bit to the left of center, and I was certainly to the right of center. But I respected his views. We talked, and also there's another novel idea. I don't want to bring up a difficult subject, but let's just talk maybe a minute about guns. How would you ever really deal with that? If I were in the Senate now, I'd go over to Tom and say, you know what, this is an issue, and let's do two things. Number one, let's get us a group, maybe 3 of your guys and gals and 3 of mine, and let's have those 6 sort of reflective of the different points of view and see if there's some areas where something can be done. And then I have another novel idea. Have some votes, for God's sake. But y'all might all remember one time we had a real shootout in the Senate, vote after vote after vote on a variety of gun-related amendments. This would have been, I guess, in maybe the late 90s or after the turn of the century. But that's the way you get to a product. You let the members engage. Have votes on amendments. Tom and I used to have senators come and say, oh, no, please don't make us vote on those amendments on the appropriations bill. And that's one reason why they quit doing appropriations bills, because the members didn't want to cast tough votes on an appropriations bill. And here was my answer to them. You're a United States Senator, for God's sake. You got a 6-year term. Ante up and kick in, as Morgan Freeman said in the movie Glory. So, you can't let leaders wimp out.
That's right.
But it takes, if you do that too much, you become the former Speaker, John Boehner. You know what I mean? So, but we need to think about that sort of thing, I think, a little bit more.
Before we turn to the audience, can I ask each of you, looking at the way things are today, which all of us regret, looking back on your experience, are you hopeful that we can bring civility, comedy, getting things done back to the United States Senate? Tom?
I am. I talk to younger people and newer people, and I think there is a desire to find a way to make it work better. And so I'm encouraged, and I will also say, this isn't the only time in history when we've had difficulty. There's not been any caning on the Senate floor, at least as long as we've been around, but there was when Charles Sumner was attacked, and there have been times when we've gone through some very vitriolic and very confrontational, poisonous periods as well. And so I think we go through cycles. We're in a new era with new technology and television and all the money and all the things we talked about, but we'll find a way to get through it. And Trent, I just go back to something Trent just said. There's no way you can emphasize how important it is to have strong leadership. Leadership that isn't afraid to make a decision, leadership that isn't afraid to commit their members, leadership that isn't afraid to walk across the aisle and work something out with the other leader. You got to have that, but you've got to have it at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue too. And that's a problem right now, in my view, that we're going to have to live with for a while.
Mary,
Yeah,
hopeful?
I am hopeful and agree with what Tom said, but I do think at this particular time we have a real challenge with the person who's in the presidency in terms of making that possible. And I've worked with many, many different presidents of all parties, and I've never quite seen, and I don't think we've quite seen anything like this in terms of, just setting a tone and a character that is, I think, not up to the standards that we've all become used to. And I think it makes it extra difficult for the Republican leadership more than the Democratic leadership. It makes it very hard for the Republican leadership to figure out what they can do and how much room they have, because what's coming out of 1600 Pennsylvania is so unpredictable. Now, you never knew exactly what President Bush was going to do or exactly what President Clinton was going to do, but you had a pretty good idea, and you could count on their word, which was most important. You could also count on their intellect and their personal understanding of the issues. In fact, in a funny way, I'll never forget, as long as I live, John Breaux and I called to the Oval Office to talk with President Clinton. We went in to talk with him, let's just say, about a levee project in Louisiana. That would be something John and I would want to talk about. And he spent 45 minutes talking with us about the mating patterns of salmon in the Northwest. I mean, the man's intellect, I was like, what is he talking about? But he was so interested in this particular subject, and he knew more about it than even the scientists that study it. So at some point there was some intellectual rigor coming out of that, which you could kind of understand the different presidents' personalities. Anyway, having said that, we'll remain hopeful. Hopefully some young people can get us moving in the right direction and find a way to be proud again of our government and argue in a civil way and help make our government work better in the future.
Breaking news, Bill Clinton was interested in mating problems.
Hey, Bill,
Senator-
I'm hopeful
Yeah.
too.
Okay, I was
for a
gonna come to
variety of
that.
reasons.
Okay.
Number one, how low can you go? At some point, you say this is bad, and I still talk to a lot of the senators, a lot of them that have come since I retired, and let me just tell you, there is a growing concern about the inability to get a result, to produce anything, and it's across the aisle. It is people like Perdue and Rounds and Hoeven and Joni Ernst and Democrats too. And the Senate right now is the oldest age that it's ever been. One of the points that I would make to my former colleagues, if you're as old as I am, it's time to get out. So when I look at the people that'll be coming up on the Republican and Democratic side, House and Senate, I believe this next generation realizes that they're looking bad, they're not producing for America, and they're going to try to change it. You got to have hope, and certainly in this area, we got to hope that it's going to begin to change. The media, you talk about the media, it is very different. The Facebook and emails and the negativity, the vulgarity, the mean-spiritedness, the 24/7 news cycle, the tribal thing that Tom talks about. I mean, John Breaux and I are great friends. We've been friends for years. We've been partners for 10 since both of us out of the Senate. But every day, I read the Wall Street Journal to calm down. I read the Washington Post to get mad. I watch Fox. He's next door. He's reading the New York Times, the Washington Post, and but he does read the Wall Street Journal to his credit. But he's listening to MSNBC and CNN. We're two completely different silos. And that has all contributed to the atmosphere we have now. And we've got to think about how do we begin to turn it back to what made this country great. And I believe it can be done.
Senator, glimmer of hope?
Oh, absolutely. But I also think it's important for the American people to become engaged in this process. That's one of my issues, and one I encourage young people to think about as they look to their own futures and getting involved in public service, is that we are a representative democracy. We get the government we demand. If we demand bipartisanship, if we demand compromise, then we will get it. And I just don't think that any one of us can afford to sit on the sidelines, because again, it incentivizes elected officials when they know that they have the public behind them. And so I always say that the voices of cooperation have to override the voices of polarization. And really, if you think about it, it's the political minority in this country that on both sides of the equation, they're really governing the process, both externally and internally. And we have to change that. And we can change it internally with procedures and process, but there has to be a will to work across the aisle and to get things done, not just pivot to the next election. I see the big difference from the 30-plus years that I was in Congress is that in the first year of the two-year session, we had a synchronized agenda between the Congress and the President to work on key issues that face this country. Now it's just one perpetual campaign. That basically there is no governing legislative agenda. That's been virtually abandoned. And so ultimately, everybody looks to how they can position themselves, how they can message themselves on every amendment, every statement, every utterance for the next election, rather than thinking about what is for the greater good of this country. I should comment on our former colleague, Al Simpson, who once said, if you can't learn to compromise without compromising your principles, you better not go into business, you better not become a legislator, and you better not get married.
If seeing things the way they are today, I want to give credit to Steve Billett, who asked this question in his panel, Seeing the things the way they are today, if you were just starting out, would you run for office?
Sure. It was a great experience. I've been so blessed, and even if I knew I was going to make the same dumb mistakes again, yeah, I'd go for it.
Mary?
I want to say I had one goal, my principal goal when I ran. I always talked about it. People don't talk about it much anymore, but I was worried about government spending and deficits and, the debt and what we're building up. And so my proudest moment was when Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich and all of us came to a budget agreement that led to a balanced budget and a surplus. It can be done. So, yeah, I'd do it again.
Would you?
I'm not sure. I loved the time I was in, but I came here because my father was a civil rights leader, and I wanted to help advance the women's agenda for the country. And because John Kennedy was so inspirational when I was a child, and Martin Luther King, and it's like those people are no longer here, those calls, those beacons to come and do something. And when you look at who's in the White House, I don't think I would be very inspired in a positive way. I think if I were young, I would be angry, which is I think what a lot of young people are now, angry and want to change. So maybe my rebellious nature I would have come at it a different way. I came at it wanting to be a part of something that I thought was really exciting and hopeful, even though the civil rights movement was tough and I knew that women were struggling. I thought I want to be a part of that struggle, and I was so moved by so many people. I mean, even I can remember as a kid, even though she's not that much older really than I am, but Barbara Mikulski, hearing her voice on the television, it was like, oh my gosh, look at that woman, how strong she is. And I wonder what young people look and see. It hurts my heart to think, what are they seeing? So maybe they'll come at it because they're angry, like Olympia said, and want to fix it, and hopefully they will.
You ready? Do it again? Would you today?
Absolutely, yes, I would. In fact, I always say to young people, medical science says you're going to live to 125, so how long do you want to put up with this? We need to get involved, and you can change it. And so we have to inspire them to change and encourage them to engage in public service, and they can make a difference. And frankly, if we don't sit on the sidelines and they engage, it can make a difference. If we sit on the sidelines, we can't make a difference. And so silence is not golden in this instance. So I'm encouraged by the young people. I would run today because I think that we are empowered to make change, and we can do it.
Do it all over again?
Bill, in over 40 years of being in and around politics, I have yet to find one person who said, I'm really sorry I ran for office. I've never, win or lose, everybody I have ever talked to has said, I'm glad I ran. And I think there is this sense of just commitment and participation. The key to a good democratic republic is participation. And it's got to be beyond just one's vote. There has to be a time when you have to give back. And running for office can be a rewarding, gratifying experience. And as I say, everybody that I've ever talked to who have experienced it has been proud of the fact that they did and would do it again.
How about a hand from the audience here, right? Yes, I got a hand too. How about a question hand?
I got the mic, so who?
You got the mic over here? Looks like this table wins. Got the hands up first.
Question?
Go ahead.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for having this lecture series. And I've served 23 years in the House, and I wish that the nation could watch this conversation, because I live in a small town in California, and they don't pay a lot of attention to Washington, but they care deeply about what's falling apart in this town. And I would hope that all of you, 4 of you, would form an op-ed piece for the New York Times, Washington Post, and Wall Street Journal, just making those suggestions. Because I think the leadership needs to be pushed, knowing that there's bipartisan support out there. One, on this staying in Washington. I think you're absolutely brilliant on this. The House votes 1 week from Tuesday to Friday, and the next week from Monday to Thursday. There is 1 weekend every month where the House leaves on Friday and comes back on Monday. Why not use that 1 weekend to stay in Washington? And to meet with the Senate. Wouldn't it be wonderful to have a House and Senate members meeting together? And I think earmarks, I was an appropriator. I think what we ought to do is allow every member to have an earmark. Give them $1 million. Remember when we did the transportation bill? That was, everybody got their own project. But do that to every member. Say you're getting $1 million, $2 million, whatever it is. And that would bring commodity because people would vote for that. They want to get it done. They'd go home and say, yes, I got, and limit it to public projects. Don't allow private projects in there. And lastly, what was the third issue that you talked about was?
The money?
Money
Or
in the airplane and the media.
Well, then, the media. What's missing, and I don't know how we correct this, Bill, is that we used to listen to the news to find the answer. Now we listen to the news to have a Hollywood gossip session at night about what happened during the day, and we'll have opinions of people on both sides of the aisle, but there's no bottom line there of how are we trying to solve a problem. I don't know how we address that other than having kind of the 60 minutes of, okay, let's take an issue like the border wall and go out and hear all the opinions of why it should be built and the opinions why it shouldn't, and let the viewer understand that there is compromise in these issues. Because I don't think the media is allowing us to find where that compromise is. But I think if you 2, 3, 4, the fathers and the mothers of our nation would write something and publish it and urge our leadership to follow your ideas, we could make a much stronger, better Congress. Thank you for having this conversation.
There's a challenge. There's a challenge. Just, we'll take this one last question then. Dan?
Senators, thank you very much. Dan Manatt and Senator Daschle, thank you for bringing up the Sumner caning, because I was going to think I was going to have to be the skunk at the party, feeling that there's a little bit of revisionism going on here, whether it be that or if you drive down Glebe Road, go past the spot where Henry Clay and Randolph dueled, not just Burr and Hamilton, but just across Chain Bridge. Nonetheless, and I worked on the Hill as a lowly staffer with Congressman Farr staffer and so forth in the 90s, and I don't remember it quite as the glory days that I'm hearing to some extent. Nor do I have to imagine Senator Lott might have felt a little different when Senator Jeffords switched parties. I have to imagine, Senator Daschle, you might have felt a little different about comedy when Senator Lott felt what I think is going to go down as profile in courage, your stance on the Iraq War. And Senator Lott said that would come back to haunt you in your election, and then Senator Frist went and campaigned against you. So I wonder about the revision. But I do have a question.
Question. Is there a question?
Senator Snowe, when I worked on the Hill, I worked on campaign reform, McCain-Feingold, with Scotty Basler in the House. And you were always sort of like our tipping point. We always thought you represented the centrist key votes, obviously in the Senate, but working with Tom Allen and so forth, folks like you in the House. I always wondered, seeing what happens with Senator King, with Senator Jeffords and so forth, I wonder why there aren't more folks who might break away in the blue dog fashion, or even just to break away and start the third party. We've seen through history with obviously the Republican Party and so forth. Why haven't we seen more interest by certain leaders in the Northeast and so forth in forming a third party?
Well, it certainly, that would be a challenge, I think, to create another party. Doesn't mean to say that it couldn't happen, and could, may well happen, ultimately, because I think both current parties have to demonstrate that they have the capacity, to govern in this country through the elected officials whom they nominate. And so I think that is, something that's possible, but we've essentially been a two-party, country, and I think that it would be hard to, set up, a third party at this point. Doesn't mean to say, as I said, that it couldn't happen ultimately, but, and I think that it really is incumbent upon members of Congress to demonstrate that they have the capacity to govern. And if both parties can't do that through, controlling both the legislative and the executive branches, then there is, possibly a third way. There is that, obviously, a strain of independence in my state, but it isn't easy to set up because that hasn't been our historical norm. But it is possible. at
You
some
know, let me
point.
just jump
Yes.
in on that just briefly.
Senator.
You know, I really do think, look, the effort for third parties has never worked out too well, whether it's bull moves or, but I actually think, and I never was a centrist, but that there's a need for some centrist in both parties. Now, the Democrats have gone so far to the left, they call themselves progressives, and Republicans are hard right. I mean, Olympia and Judd Gregg and Slade Gordon as Republicans had an effect on us. Now, when I was first leader, my entire leadership group was a bunch of Southerners. Don Nichols from Oklahoma, Connie Mack from Florida, and we would meet, and boy, we were all excited. We were ready to go. We knew what the agenda was going to be. Then I would call on somebody like Olympia or a Judd Gregg or Slade Gordon and say, is there a contrarian view? And they would tear our head off. They would say, have you thought about how the Northeast would think? What about women, by the way? There are no women in this room. Maybe we ought to reconsider. So I think it was better when we had Northeastern moderates in the Republican Party and boll weevils in the Democratic Party. Right. And there ain't many of them left either. They're almost extinct. And of course, they went from being boll weevils to blue dogs to, I call them cicadas. They went underground and came back, 7 years later. But and look, John Breaux was kind of a centrist, boll weevil, blue dog Democrat. And I remember specifically when George W. Bush tried to get his first tax cut, that rascal tiptoed over and got Olympia to agree with him that the tax bill was too much. Well, and I think that was when we were 50-50. But anyway, he had stolen Olympia. I didn't have the votes. So what did we do? We had to negotiate. And we negotiated it down. And I don't remember the exact numbers, but it's like it was going to be like 1.3 trillion. We got it down to 900 billion or something. Where I'm from, $900 billion tax cut's still pretty damn good. We got it done. So I'm rather than bring it into third party, I really wish we could get a little more balance in both of the existing parties. I think it'd be better for the country.
Can I make a point on that? Because I think that Trent, emphasizes a key element, is that historically the parties did embrace, diverse views. And now, as I mentioned earlier about the narrow ideological base, that's the problem. Become intolerant, ideologically, philosophically, and politically intolerant of diverse views. And certainly that's happened within the Republican Party. And so I think hence that's why you're narrowing it. You need the centrists in order to build solutions on both sides. Now, I remember once that Trent did say to somebody, he said, the good news is we have a majority of one on the Senate Finance Committee. The bad news is that one is Olympia Snowe.
Did I say that?
Let me just wrap up by saying a key word that we've heard over and over here in this panel is leadership. And I must say that I know when the history of the United States Senate is written, among the great leaders of the United States Senate will be Tom Daschle and Olympia Snowe and Mary Landrieu and Trent Lott. And we thank you so much for your time. Thank you.
Please stay here for just a moment. I just wanted to say a couple things. One, thank you so much, Bill Press, for moderating this panel. Two, thank you to our extraordinary senators for being here. Three, thank you to Frank J. Fahrenkopf and the Charles T. Manatt endowed lecture series, which allowed us to bring together these people to have this lunch and have this conversation. This is something that we do as a part of the Graduate School of Political Management all the time. And the other thing I wanted to let you know is that this is part of the reason why at the Graduate School of Political Management, we actually educate students who are at all points on the ideological spectrum. We encourage students to come to us with their what. And our job is to teach them the how. We really care about how do people work together, not necessarily just what they believe. And I would argue, and I think that part of our challenge of where we are at this moment is that people have forgotten that most of politics is actually transactional. It's about who gets what, where, and how. It's not necessarily existential. And it has become so sort of crisis-driven and identity-defined that we are now at a place where if you lose, it means you're not going to survive. And that is part of the problem. We need to get back to this place where we can understand that compromising doesn't necessarily mean you're losing all your principles or you've given up everything that you stand for. The final thing I want to do is just let Representative Farr know that we have been live streaming this conversation. It will be captured. You can share it with any and all of your friends out there in the social media universe. And were you to write an op-ed, you can put a hyperlink to it and let people see all that you've shared and all the wisdom you've imparted this afternoon. So let me thank you for being here again. Please know that there are more and more panels this afternoon. There's a fantastic conversation that will continue tonight. So thank you again for taking the time to be here today. Thank you to all involved.
Good to see you, Mary.